So welcome again to InfoVis Design Studios lectures. This is week 3, and this is the second video. We're going to be talking about Datavis usability. In the previous video, we did a bit of a refresher course on usability testing itself. Now we're going to be talking about what does that mean in a data visualization context. We're specifically going to be focusing, those of you who are picking up assignment 1 will be happy to hear this, on what does usability testing look like for an infographic, the kind of visualization that you guys are developing in that first assignment. And to do this, we're going to use Steph's 7 steps and going to talk about what each one of those means in a Datavis context, and then how that will inform the kind of tasks that you want people to do, the questions that you want to ask, and the sort of answers that you're looking for. So we have the research component, where the major question is what do they need? Followed by a strategy or strategic design component, where your major answer is what is the value proposition of the thing that we're putting together? What makes it better than the alternatives or the current system? From that value prop, you develop a set of concepts, each of which is designed to address that value proposition or make it real in some way. From that, you develop somewhat simultaneously the approach for what you're interested in validating and the prototype that you're going to use to validate it. See the previous video for a discussion about sort of the orders in which these things happen and the dependencies that they have on each other. Again, Steph's perspective, and the one that I agree with, is that you should always be thinking about the next test, because that drives the purpose of whatever it is you're doing now, both in academia, but also in the real design world. Everything that you're doing is driven by what your next milestone is and how you demonstrate it. And then after you've built your prototype and worked out what you're testing, then you're going to get your answers. You're going to perform that synthesis where you take your answers and you try and work out what it means and answer the question which parts of your value proposition were really embedded in the prototype that you put together and what needs to change so the rest can come along with it. So that research component we talked about in last week's video on making your point. In order to understand any visualization design task, there are 4 things you need to get your head around. You need to understand the purpose, whether it's predominantly exploratory, helping someone answer questions, or explanatory, providing someone with insights. In the infographic context that we're going to be working, it's explanatory. Who's your audience? What do they know? What are they interested in? What are their level of data science understanding, their sort of data literacy? And what is the context in which this visualization will be consumed? And of course, what data do you have available and how can you massage it to tell the story that you want to tell? So once you've done that research, you move on to what is your value proposition, the strategic design component. And here, your value proposition is that you have a set of insights you want your user to have. You want to lead them, guide them to having these particular thoughts that you hope will be insightful, emotive, effective, etc. And again, from last week's video, the Making Your Point video, I believe that the way to capture that is through one of these user insight journey diagrams, which is a kind of user journey where you're primarily interested in what are the things that you hope they discover, how are they feeling with each discovery, and then the sequence of those discoveries that drive them up to whatever the primary insight, the key thing that you want someone to take away from this visualization. Of course, there might be particular drill downs, places where people can go and learn more about particular parts, but I feel each infographic should have a mostly linear pathway to build people up to, prepare them for, and then deliver whatever the main point is. That user insight journey is your encapsulation of your value proposition. That is the reason why this infographic that you're working on should exist. And it's armed with that we can start to say, what do you build and what do you test? So now you're into conceptual design, and your main question here is, how do we address that value proposition? How do we take people on that journey? And this is where you're sketching, and in doing so, answering questions like, how do all these pieces flow together? What kind of mappings do I use? What visualizations do I need? Which parts need to be more prominent than others to guide people to understand these things in the right sequence? And then what details are we going to need around those visualizations to help contextualize them? Details like text, supporting images, annotations, where you call out particular things and say, hey, this is interesting, you should look at this part. All of those questions you should have at least broad answers for in the conceptual design, the sketching stage, because then you can start doing your prototyping. What do we need to check as part of our usability testing, which Steph and I believe is the thing that informs your prototyping? Well, do users clearly understand our story? Is our value proposition articulate, effective, valid? And here, this is the bit that you should be paying attention to if you're primarily interested in what do I do in assignment 1. When you're doing a usability test in a visualization context, you want to ask a series of questions that build up towards the user's understanding of that story. You don't want to just dive in and ask them what story do you think they're telling, because you want to understand how they've been taken on that journey. You want to understand which bits they understood, which, if any, bits they failed to understand, like where did their understanding break, where did their journey deviate from the one you were hoping that they would take. And then you want to understand what parts are obvious, what parts took some thought, because you want to make that journey as smooth as you can. So to give an example of some of the questions, and I don't want you to ask exactly these questions because there's a nuance that goes into these things that I'll hopefully help you understand. You want to ask initially simple questions like, hey, what are you seeing here? What do you think this infographic is about? Then you might ask them to answer a simple mapping question that'll capture whether they understand the basics of what's being visualized. Hey, what's the highest blah? What do you think the lowest blah is? Can you tell me which thing was the worst or the best or whatever? Then, if your visualization captures any causative information, like why stuff happened, you say, well, why do you think that happened, talking about the best or the worst or whatever it was, so that they can sort of explain how they think that happened. Of course, if that's not in your visualization, don't ask that question. You're not asking people about their general knowledge about the topic. You want their capacity to understand what's on the page in front of them. If there's some kind of temporal component, as that data are changing over time in your visualization, you might ask them, is the trend good or bad? Do you think this is getting better or do you think this is getting worse? If you're visualizing climate change data, then hopefully they'll say something like, wow, this looks really terrible. We're not really getting our hands around this. We're not getting a grip on it. If you're visualizing COVID vaccination data, then hopefully people would be able to say, yeah, it really looks like vaccination rates, at least as of right now, March 2021, are taking off. And it's only after asking all of those basic questions, after you've gotten answers that tell you whether they've understood the basics, understood the mapping, understood some of the simpler parts of your visualization, you might ask them, well, what story do you think the designer is trying to tell here? What is this visualization trying to tell you? What do you think this is for? And they will hopefully articulate back to you something that is recognizably the story that you wanted to tell, your major insight. And if not, hopefully you've now got enough information about why they're thinking that way to refine your visualization to better capture that story. So those questions are pretty abstract, so let's go through some examples. Here's a visualization of the components of the global CO2 emissions and what we might need to do to halve global emissions, to decarbonize by 50% by 2030 and completely by 2050. So we could start by asking, what are you seeing here? And hopefully people would say something along those lines. This is a picture of what makes up all the carbon emissions. You might ask people, what's the largest single contributor? And you'd hope they'd say something like residential buildings, but they might give a different answer. Here, there's not really any causative information about where those emissions are coming from, so you wouldn't ask that question. You'd ask something more like, what can we do to reduce emissions in the industrial sector? And here I think is where you might run into a couple of usability issues with this otherwise quite good visualization, because the key, which is actually up in that top right-hand corner, is really not easy to see. People are likely to turn to the large saturated yellow component immediately to the right of the yellow bits on the tree map, right? So you've got these yellow bits on the tree map here that are all labeled industry. People are probably going to look right here in this big yellow box for what do the yellow bits mean? And they're going to see this text, better recycling of raw materials. And they're going to be like, I think these are better ways to recycle raw materials. These things, I mean, what we need to do here is recycle materials, because it's not clear to see the word industry over here or the little word industry up the top here defining what yellow means. That might not jump out to people at first, and that's an opportunity for something to be changed as a result of the usability testing. You can't really ask a question about trend here, but what you could ask is, what were the major things that you might have to do to get to 50% emissions in, let's say, the transport sector by 2030? And you'd hope people then would be able to list off electric vehicles, increase public transport, etc. So hopefully after going through those, you could ask someone, well, what do you think this is trying to tell you? And you'd hope that they'd get an answer of like, well, this gives sort of some strategies and how each of them would be effective, but mostly overall it shows that a lot of action is needed across the economy and across the globe to make any major inroads towards a zero carbon society. Not a happy message, but a true one, and one that we all need to start getting our heads around. By contrast, you might want to do a usability test of a visualization like this. This is a really, I think, emotively resonant visualization of deaths in war. This screenshot doesn't do it justice. It's quite interactive. Head to poppyfield.org and check it out. Pause me now, I won't mind. Go check it out right away. And this shows major wars and the breakdown of deaths by continent in the last, century and a bit. And you can see the two very large poppies there are obviously World Wars I and II, the most destructive conflicts in human history. And then there's a large component of smaller wars since then. So you might ask people, what are you seeing? And you'd hope they'd be able to divine that, which would be easier to see if they'd seen the sort of intro screen that you get when you first load the page. And you could ask people, what's the largest one? And they would, in this case, that's pretty easy to sort out. There's one poppy here that's bigger than all of the others. Poppies, by the way, for those who aren't aware, have a long association, primarily in Europe, with remembering war dead. So that's the metaphor that's being gathered here. And poppies blowing in the wind is a metaphorical affiliation to, the fragility of human experience. There's not really any causative information here, so you wouldn't ask that question, but you would probably ask people about the trend, and hopefully they'd be able to say, well, maybe two things. One is that wars are getting longer, that you can see that over time the poppies are more bent over and the stalks are longer, which in this visualization shows that the wars are getting very, very long indeed. But that in aggregate, the death rates seem to be smaller. There are fewer short wars, there are more long wars, but fewer people are dying in each. I know it's partially good news. And then hopefully after answering those questions, you could ask them something more summative. You could say, what do you think this is trying to tell you? And they're probably trying to make it more aware to those of us in the first world where there are fewer ongoing conflicts of this sort, that war has been with us for a long time and still continues to be with us as a fact of life for many of the much less fortunate people throughout the globe. I don't know whether someone's going to say something like that, but you'd hope that you get that vibe out of them, because that's clearly what's trying to be communicated here. So once you've got your answers to those questions that are trying to grasp whether the story is being captured in the user experience, you want to synthesize them and see if there's data there to support this idea that the journey the users are going on comports with the one that you planned for them to go on. Like, are they experiencing your visualization in the way that you intended? Are they having the intended insights? Are they having them in the right order? And are they having the emotive response that you expect them to have when they do so? And if it seems that that is the case, well, then you have a visualization that is both valid, and if you've been following a cohesive, rigorous design process, and your value proposition is supported by your user research, and your concepts embody your value proposition, and your prototype is designed to test the bits of your concept you're least certain about, or the decisions that you're not sure how to make, and then you find your results and your synthesis support that your prototype really does embody that user journey that you want people to go on, is a valid prototype, then if you've done all of that robust design, then you can also say that it is a valuable design. That your system is not only doing what you say, but that what you say will really help. And then you're done. You'll get a good mark in the assignment, or you'll get a good feedback from your client, and you have in general had a good day today. So that's all I wanted to cover in the Datavis usability video. I hope this has helped you understand what I'm expecting from you in assignment 1, but also how we should approach design. It captures some of my and Steph's philosophy that design is this wonderful melding of a very open-minded, creative, flourishing, innovative, free expression of what is interesting and novel and original and different, but that all of that originality, all of that creativity is driven by making sure through a rigorous process that you have actually built the right thing. And that hopefully you understand now, or maybe some of you understood before, how following these steps will get you to a point where your Datavis is not only going to have the same intended response from your users, but that intended response will actually communicate the things that you want to communicate. So hopefully that gives you a way to tackle assignment 1. And with that, I'll see you in class.